I used to know a guy, and he hated shopping. It's interesting, for those of you here this morning, you heard Tom talk about how he hated the daily shop. It was just, too much burden. And I used to know someone, and he would go into Sainsbury's or Tesco or wherever, and he'd make a start. He'd start well. Get the fresh veg in, the fruit, move on to the meat, the cheese, the dairy, all that. But all the time, he's just hating every second. Too much pressure. And eventually, he'd put his quid in the trolley already, and he'd get to about halfway round. We're talking about the beans or the ketchup aisle, somewhere around there. It's like, no, I'm done. And he'd leave his trolley there in the middle of the supermarket, half full of stuff, still with the quid in the trolley, and go home. It's too much. Can't handle it. Giving up, going home. For those of you who are familiar with the Spider-Man stories, you'll know that Spider-Man, he tries to do his best. He's trying all the time, isn't he, to do his best to help people. But all the time, he's facing criticism. He's under the cosh. He's being opposed by the newspaper and all these other people. Feels like giving up. He's trying to do the right thing. He just feels like giving up all the time. And if you are here this evening and you've been a Christian for any length of time, you'll know, won't you, that there are times when you just want to give up. You just feel like giving up. Maybe there are specific commands, areas of your life where you say to God, what you're asking of me here is too much. It's too much. I want to give up. Maybe there are Christian habits, regular habits, where after years of following them, they just become wearing. Getting along on it every Sunday, doing hospitality, reading your Bible, whatever it is, you just think, I feel like giving up. And then there are times, aren't there, and some of you will know this, some of you maybe have yet to experience this, where you might receive direct opposition, criticism, because you're a Christian. Opposition in the workplace, being excluded from social gatherings, from friendship networks, because you follow Jesus. And after a while, again, you feel like just giving up. And I think it's especially hard when you feel like you've been trying to do the right thing. God, don't you know I've been trying to follow you, and why is it still so hard? The psalm we've got this evening, Psalm 11, is written by King David. King David was called by God himself to be Israel's king. But at various stages in his journey, he faced all kinds of opposition, all kinds of hardship. And there are times, and he expresses it for us tonight in this psalm, when it was just felt like too much. When he felt like giving up would be the easiest thing to do. So that kind of gives us our first big idea this evening. It's this. Don't give up. Don't give up. It's as simple as that. In following Jesus, in following the track he's laid down for you, don't give up. You can see that there's a choice in verse 1 between two options. Option 1, in the Lord I take refuge. Or option 2, and this is the advice sounds like he's getting from his counselors, flee like a bird to your mountain. Actually, it's got a mocking tone. It's almost like, flee, little birdie. Go on, you little weakling, get off with you. You can't hack this anymore. That's the choice when we're feeling like giving up. Take refuge or give up. The choice between taking refuge or a quick escape, just avoiding the bother. And that advice, doesn't it appeal to you sometimes? It gets to you in your deepest insecurities, your keenest felt fears, and your greatest longings. Just give it in. Give it up. And I guess seen from a particular angle, it kind of makes sense. Look at verses 2 and 3. The threat that David is facing is real. The imagery that he's using is warfare imagery. It's of bows and arrows. It's an attack from the shadows. Why is it significant that it's an attack from the shadows? Because something from the shadows, it's hard to see it coming. You don't know when it's going to happen. So it's hard to avoid. Hard to counter. And all in all, what's the sort of the end result in verse 3? This is when the foundations look like they're being destroyed. I wonder if David particularly has in mind the fear that the nation of Israel, the place where God is ruling his people, whether those very foundations are being undermined by this opposition. And I guess that advice, flee, give up, kind of makes sense, doesn't it, if you feel that all is lost. Thankfully, I've never been on a sinking ship. That's something I've yet to tick off. But I have been at sea in rough weather with the waves crashing over the bows. But it's not got so bad that someone says, all is lost, abandon ship. That's the message that he's being advised with here. There's that moment, isn't there, in Lord of the Rings where they're fighting the underground demon Balrog, and Gandalf says to them, look, here is a foe beyond you all. Fly, you fools. You can't deal with this. You've got to give up. Trying to represent it with a diagram here. This is, I guess, what it feels like when the Christian is trying to follow Jesus and a threat comes along. And sometimes the instinct is that, just to give up. That's the response. But verse 1, in the Lord I take refuge. Don't give up. So I think, how do we take this to ourselves today, this evening, here in Kempston and Bedford? What are the threats or the difficulties that we're facing? And like I said, some of those threats that some of you will be facing will be personal. There'll be people who target you, who make your life difficult because you're a Jesus follower. But there are lessons here for all of us. Whatever the circumstances we're following, whatever our situation, following Jesus, it feels like too much. And like giving up is the easiest option. It's about any situation where it feels like it would be easier to give up than to continue where we are on the track God has laid down for us to follow. I wonder where we see the foundations being destroyed. I think there are three things that come to mind. One, and you may be familiar with this kind of thinking, there's that thinking that is what you call kind of apocalyptic thinking, disaster thinking. Doctors and psychologists call it catastrophizing. Catastrophizing, where you think, it's all gone, it's all going wrong, it's all going to end in disaster. And there's quite a lot of that type of thinking around at the moment, isn't there? Climate change, Brexit, Trump, all those kind of things, and the kind of the media way of reporting, everything is going, it's done. All the foundations are being destroyed. You can feel it on a personal level too, can't you? Everything is going to end in disaster. Just give up. Secondly, I think we can feel like our foundations are being destroyed when we feel like this thing that makes me, me, I'm losing that. That's sometimes on a very personal level where you can feel like you're losing your foundations. It can happen kind of with ill health. If you maybe get a chronic illness, it means you can't do all the things that you used to do that you felt made you, you. There's been in the news, hasn't there, all the steel industry down in Port Talbot. There's that idea, I've been a steel worker all my life. My dad was a steel worker, and now it's gone. Who am I now? Helen Thorne came to talk to us before the summer, didn't she, about the menopause. And she said, look, for some women, when they go through the menopause, one of the feelings they have, the keenest feeling, I'm losing that which made me feel like me. Give up. And maybe thirdly, I think some of us may feel, we look back at this country over the last 30, 50, 60, 80 years, and you think, everything that made this country what it was, the kind of the influence of Christian values, all of that is being undermined. All of that is being eroded. Those foundations are going away. Just give up. So what does giving up look like then? What are some of the ways that giving up looks like? Again, I've got three suggestions. You might relate to different ones of these. The first one is this: get out. In the face of all these kind of these feelings of foundations of being destroyed, I'm just going to get out. Withdraw. Isolate myself from the world around me. We were living up in Derbyshire, and our neighbours were very religious family, and they felt, look, it's all going to pot. There's no point staying here. And they moved to Chile because they felt that would be a sort of a safer place for them. Maybe you just feel like you want to get out. Can you identify with that? I just want to live far away from all the things that I find difficult. You want to get out. Secondly, you might want to get the upper hand. You might want to get the upper hand. We see this, don't we, where the response to that change in society is a kind of a desire to reimpose Christian values, the kind of the culture war approach. How is that giving up? Well, let me put it like this. I think there's a risk, if you're tempted to do this, to give up on the Christian values of tolerance, of gentleness, of compromise and compassion. I want to just get the upper hand. We're so grieved by what we see as the loss. Some of us are willing to use all the levers of worldly power to try and impose Christian values on the world around us. But God says we need to be in the world, not of the world. And God never promises that the world will respect Christians. In fact, quite the opposite, doesn't it? We are to expect opposition. And our response is to be one of love, understanding, gentle persuasion, as we try and make a difference where we are, in the neighborhoods we are, in the workplaces we're at. Just like we heard from Addison earlier, and how she tries to live out her Christian faith in her workplace. Some of us will try to get the upper hand and give up on that sort of Christian living. And finally this, giving in. Sometimes giving up can look like giving in. It's so, the way the world thinks and works around us, it can be so attractive sometimes and so overwhelming. It can be tempting, can't it? Just say, well, I might as well just fit in. Just accept the way things are. Adopt the values of our culture around us, to give up on Christian distinctiveness, to give in and lose all those things that make us the holy people of God. Verse 1, in the Lord I take refuge. Don't give up. Maybe just take a few moments, 10, 30 seconds, just reflect on those things and maybe write a note down, if that's what you do, of maybe the one thing that you feel particularly that you struggle with, the one temptation, the one way you feel like you might be tempted to give up. And then we'll move on to the second half. Well, if the big idea of the first half was don't give up, in the Lord I take refuge, the second half kind of gives us the reason, the inspiration, the motivation for that. The big idea of the second half is this: God is with you and he's in charge. God is with you and he is in charge. Look at verse 4 with me. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. I guess one of the things we can feel when we're struggling, when we are on the receiving end of opposition, is that God is far away and that he's not in control. But verse 4 says, no, this is God as he really is. He says he's in his temple. Temple is the meeting place where God meets with his people. So he's saying, look, no, God is with you, whatever you feel. God is on his heavenly throne. It means God is ruling with all the power of heaven. And he sees everyone. Verse 4. He observes everyone. His eyes examine them. You've got this sense, haven't you, of, there's a reason why we picked the lighthouse as kind of the image for this series. You've got this sense of God planted, rooted on the rock, still. And there's all this chaos and this frothing and this turbulence in the world, smashing against the lighthouse. But the lighthouse stays firm, stays still. Stays unmoved, undeterred. That's God in verse 4. And he's with us and he's in charge. And then we see in verse 5 and 6, not just who God is, but we see what God hates. Picks up in verse 5, the Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion. When this word examines, it's not just like with a magnifying glass, do you know what I mean? Like getting really close to something so you can see it. Examines here is this sense of weighing, evaluating, sifting. The image is really of a smith working with precious metals and purifying them. He weighs things. And because he is holy, he hates evil. In fact, especially he hates those who love violence. Back in Psalm 5, we read these words, "For you are not a God who is pleased with wickedness. With you, evil people are not welcome." See, because he is holy, he cannot have anything that is not holy with him. And so we see a God who always sides with the oppressed, with the victim. And then there are terrible consequences from his hand. It says at the end of verse 6, this will be their lot. Lot, this has a sense of portion or even cup. And in Isaiah 57, we read these words, "Awake, awake, rise up, Jerusalem, for you have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath." It says, look, this is the consequence from God for all those who love evil, who are opposed to him. And I guess we should pause at that point, shouldn't we? Because this is not very comfortable language for lots of us. We're far used to saying God is, what? Love. But here we say God hates those who love violence. But I think we can relate to this. Bear with me. On the Explore course, we often do an exercise where we ask people, look, what really annoys you? Just low-level stuff. What really kind of gets under your skin? I don't know, any suggestions here, what people might say? Just little things that are just pet peeves. Go on, shout them out. Middle lane, always number one. Middle lane drivers on motorways. If that's you, we don't hate you, we love you. But it does annoy people. Anything else that people say? Not putting the top back on the jam. Nightmare scenario in the Sam's household there. Yeah, these are things that annoy people. But then we say, never mind what annoys you, what gets you really hot? What gets you upset? What gets you angry with a real wrongdoing? And that's where we get to the answers like abuse, injustice, violence, corruption, all those sorts of things. And at that point you think, well, in that case, I can relate to God. Because if me, imperfect as I am, can be angry at something wrong and something unjust, then how much more him? How much more God, when someone breaks something of his that he has made and is special to him? Again, we had that lovely, the book, I'm special because God made me. So how much more must God hate it when people hurt the ones he made, when they damage the ones that he loves? We know what that feels for us, well, how much more so for a perfect and holy God? And I guess the reason we struggle with this language is that because we are not holy. So when we hate, it's usually destructive, isn't it? It's usually harmful. We talk about hate speech and hate crime. These are all bad things. But here, the purity of God's reaction explains the nature of it. And the purity of his reaction shows us that this reaction is not something that we are to imitate with other people. We are not to imitate God in this stance. But it is, I think, the sort of God we want. We do want injustice dealt with, don't we? We don't want evil to finally win the day. And here we see a God who will one day put all evil away. God is with us, and he's in charge. So how does that help us not give up? Well, it helps us because we know that he's with us, just his presence with us. But it helps us because of this. It helps us because we have that assurance that ultimately evil will not win. So if you're feeling beaten down and beaten back because of opposition, there's the assurance here that ultimately that opposition won't win. That God's in control of it and it will be limited and one day it will be dealt with. Secondly, there's that assurance that, you know, when you feel like you're trying to do the right thing and no one is seeing it, like you're just doing your thing in private and you're like, well, no one will know. No, God sees. And so there's the assurance here that God sees and he recognizes the righteous. He recognizes the upright and all they attempt in his name. But what does it mean to take refuge? Well, we sang in that song, didn't we? We can always run to Jesus. Just now, we sang those words. We can always run to Jesus. In the Old Testament, Abraham, when he was faced with the impossible, seemingly impossible task of sacrificing his own son, what did he do? He trusted in God's promises. Literally, he trusted that God would provide. That's what it means to take refuge in God when you're faced with what looks to be impossible. Look in the New Testament, we see Jesus himself take on the role of suffering servant. He sets his face towards Jerusalem in the face of all that opposition by trusting in his heavenly Father. So we said earlier, this is one possible response when we're feeling like giving up, when the threat is on us. Well, this is what this passage is suggesting. Don't give up. Why? Because God is with us. He's in charge. When we take refuge in him, enables us, it empowers us to keep going, to not give up when we desperately want to sometimes. I was talking a little while ago to someone, and they were having real difficulty in their church. They were really struggling with a situation of conflict, and all they wanted to do was just to leave. It was so painful. They were afraid of getting it wrong, of causing hurt and disaster. It'd be just easy if I walked away. That's what they said. But then they talked it through. They took it to Scripture. They called out to God for his help. They rested in the gospel. And the forgiveness found there, and prayed. They took refuge in God. And so they stayed and they sought reconciliation. They sought to fix it. That's what it means to take refuge in God. Just as we close, it's worth noting as we close with that verse 7. God is a God who doesn't give up. He says, look, to you, don't give up. But he is a God who doesn't give up. What does it say in verse 7? For the Lord is righteous. He loves justice. The upright will see his face. This is who he is and what he promises. He is righteous. He loves justice. And one day the upright will see his face. Jesus is the upright one, of course. And all this talk of the portion or the cup in verse 6, what does it remind us of? It reminds us of Jesus when he's in the garden and he's praying his absolute heart out to his heavenly Father. And what does he pray as he prays to God in heaven? He prays these words, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Sounds like he felt like giving up, doesn't it? Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup, portion, be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. You see, Jesus willingly took that cup that the wicked deserve, that the evil deserve. So all that is described in verses 5 and 6, Jesus puts his hand up and takes that from God the Father on the cross. So that all could be treated as upright. So that all might one day see his face. Verse 1 in some ways asks the question, where is your safety? Verse 7 asks a slightly different question, doesn't it? It says, where's your heart? It says, look, one day you will see his face, follow his will, enjoy his pleasure, dwell in his grace, depend on his Spirit. It's lovely just again to hear Addison's interview, wasn't it? And hear about her attempts in the goodness of God and by the goodness of God to bring the goodness of God wherever she is. I thought it was a lovely example of taking refuge in God and not giving up. Some of you will be asking this evening, well, there's some quite hard words in tonight's passage. Does God love me? You might be thinking that if you wouldn't call yourself a Christian here this evening. Does God love me, given what we read here? I think we have to say, firstly, yes, you're here, you're alive, he made you, he loves you. But then we have to say, but he also stands opposed to all evil. He stands opposed to all those who have hurt those he loves. Does he love you? But we have to say also yes, because he sent Jesus, the upright one, to take the cup that we deserve so that we might take refuge in him, not give up, and go to be with him as he is with us. Thanks, Graham.